In the quiet moments before sleep, when the world settles into stillness and our hearts turn toward the eternal, there comes a sacred space where God's love meets our deepest longings. Tonight, we journey together through a story of divine providence, where the seeds of faith grow even in the driest seasons, and where God's perfect plan unfolds like the gentle dawn over golden fields. Let us begin in the heart of Texas, where the morning sun painted the sky in soft pastels of rose and gold, and where a young boy named Joseph Martinez knelt beside his grandfather in the rich, dark soil of their family farm. The earth was warm beneath their hands, still holding the night's dew like tiny diamonds scattered by the Creator's gentle touch. Grandfather Miguel's weathered hands moved with reverence as he placed seeds into the ground, each motion a prayer, each furrow a testament to faith. His voice, smooth as aged honey, carried the wisdom of decades spent in communion with both the earth and its maker. "Mijo," he whispered to young Joseph, his Spanish accent wrapping around the words like a warm embrace. "Do you see how we plant these seeds not knowing exactly what tomorrow will bring? The rain, the sun, the seasons, they all rest in God's hands. But we plant in faith, trusting that El Señor will provide." 8-year-old Joseph's dark eyes sparkled with wonder as he watched the tiny corn seed disappear into the earth. Something stirred within his young heart, a calling as deep and mysterious as the roots that would soon stretch toward the underground springs. The morning breeze carried the scent of mesquite and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance, meadowlarks sang their ancient songs of praise. "Abuelo," Joseph asked, his small voice filled with curiosity, "how do you know God will make them grow?" Miguel smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening like well-worn paths that led to joy. He placed his calloused hand on his grandson's shoulder and quoted softly, "As the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." The words from Isaiah seemed to dance on the morning air, and Joseph felt something settle deep in his soul, a knowing that God's promises were as sure as the sunrise, as certain as the changing seasons. He pressed another seed into the earth with newfound reverence, his child's heart already beginning to understand that he was participating in something sacred, something that connected him to the very heartbeat of creation. Days flowed into weeks, and the young corn pushed through the soil with determined grace. Joseph would wake before dawn to walk among the rows, watching in amazement as God's miracle unfolded before his eyes. The plants reached toward heaven with thanksgiving, their leaves rustling gentle hymns in the Texas wind. During these early morning walks, Joseph would often find his grandfather already there, standing quietly among the corn with his hat pressed to his chest, his lips moving in silent prayer. The sight filled Joseph with a deep peace, and he would join Miguel in these moments of communion, learning without words how to speak to the God of the harvest. "Prayer is like tending the soil of our hearts, mijo," Miguel would explain as they worked together. "God plants his dreams in us, but we must cultivate them with faith, water them with trust, and wait for his perfect timing." As Joseph grew, so did his fascination with the science behind God's creation. He would spend hours observing how the plants responded to different amounts of water, how the soil composition affected growth, how the careful rotation of crops restored nutrients to the earth. His high school teachers noticed his exceptional understanding of agricultural systems, but Joseph saw something they couldn't. He saw the hand of the divine artist painting with seeds and soil, creating abundance from apparent emptiness. The evening conversations with his grandfather became treasured moments of wisdom sharing. They would sit on the old wooden porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, the day's heat giving way to the cool embrace of night. Miguel would share stories of their ancestors, Mexican farmers who had come to Texas with nothing but faith and calloused hands, trusting God to make a way where there seemed to be no way. Our people have always known that the land is a gift from God, Miguel would say, his voice gentle as a lullaby. Not something to be conquered, but something to be stewarded with love and respect. When we work in harmony with what God has created, abundance flows like a river. Joseph absorbed these lessons like the parched earth absorbed the first rains of spring. His heart began to envision a future where his love for agriculture could serve a greater purpose, where his education could become a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern innovation. When the time came for college, Joseph felt the familiar tug of calling as he stood in those same fields where his faith had been planted. The corn rustled around him in the evening breeze, and he could almost hear God whispering through the stalks. "I have plans for you, Joseph, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future." With his grandfather's blessing and his family's prayers surrounding him like protective wings, Joseph left for the agricultural college at Texas A&M University. The transition wasn't easy. The fast pace of academic life, the pressure to excel, the homesickness that settled in his chest like a stone. But during his quiet moments of prayer in the university chapel, he would remember the feeling of rich soil between his fingers and his grandfather's patient voice, teaching him to trust in God's timing. Dr. Amanda Thompson became his mentor during his graduate studies. Her brilliant mind and passion for sustainable agriculture inspiring Joseph to dream even bigger dreams. She was a woman in her 40s with prematurely silver hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence. Under her guidance, Joseph began developing revolutionary ideas about sustainable farming practices that could feed the hungry while healing the earth. "You have a gift, Joseph," Dr. Thompson told him one afternoon as they reviewed his research on soil restoration techniques. "Your approach to agriculture isn't just scientific. There's something deeper there, something that sees the whole picture." Joseph felt his heart swell with gratitude and purpose. He began to see his research as a form of worship, each experiment a prayer offered to the God who had designed the intricate systems of creation. His work focused on developing farming methods that would be particularly beneficial for struggling communities, ways to restore depleted soil and increase crop yields without harmful chemicals. Late into the night, Joseph would work in the laboratory, but his prayers were constant companions. "Lord," he would whisper as he examined soil samples under the microscope, "show me how to help your people. Show me how to bring healing to the land." The breakthrough came during his doctoral research, an innovative system of crop rotation and natural soil enhancement that could increase yields by 40% while actually improving the health of the farmland. Joseph's excitement was infectious, and Dr. Thompson helped him present his findings at national conferences. But success brought unexpected challenges. Other researchers began to take notice of Joseph's work, and not all attention was born of admiration. Dr. Thompson introduced him to a consortium of agricultural scientists who expressed great interest in his research. Joseph, trusting and eager to share discoveries that could help struggling farmers, openly discussed his methods and shared his data. During one particularly memorable evening conference dinner, Joseph found himself surrounded by colleagues who peppered him with questions about his techniques. The hotel restaurant was elegant, with soft lighting and the gentle murmur of professional conversations, but Joseph felt a strange uneasiness he couldn't quite name. "This is revolutionary work, Joseph," said Dr. Richards, a senior researcher from a prestigious university. "Have you considered the commercial applications? This could be worth millions." Joseph shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "My hope is that these methods can be freely shared with farmers who need them most. Small family operations, struggling communities, developing nations." The group exchanged glances that Joseph missed, too focused on his vision of seeds of hope planted in the world's most challenging agricultural regions. He spoke passionately about his grandfather's wisdom, about seeing farming as stewardship rather than exploitation, about the responsibility he felt to use his gifts in service of others. What Joseph didn't realize was that his openness and trust were being carefully catalogued by minds focused on profit rather than providence. That night, as he knelt beside his hotel bed in prayer, thanking God for the opportunity to share his work, he had no way of knowing that forces were already in motion that would soon test his faith in ways he never imagined. "Thank you, Lord, for opening these doors," he prayed, his heart full of gratitude. "Help me to be wise in how I use these opportunities. Let everything I do bring glory to your name and help to your people." The months that followed were a whirlwind of presentations, publications, and growing recognition. Joseph's research was featured in agricultural journals, and he was invited to speak at conferences around the country. His methods showed remarkable success in field trials, and there was talk of implementing his techniques on a large scale. But beneath the surface, darker currents were flowing. Joseph began to notice strange inconsistencies, meetings he wasn't invited to, hushed conversations that stopped when he entered a room, research assistants who seemed to be asking questions that went beyond their assigned projects. Dr. Thompson, who had been like a mother figure to him, seemed increasingly distant. When Joseph tried to discuss his concerns with her, she would deflect with talk of academic pressures and funding challenges, but her eyes held shadows that made Joseph's spirit uneasy. The betrayal, when it came, was swift and brutal. Joseph arrived at his laboratory one morning to find his access card deactivated. Confused, he went to Dr. Thompson's office, where he found her with 2 university administrators and a lawyer he didn't recognize. The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed somehow colder than it had moments before. "Joseph," Dr. Thompson said without meeting his eyes, "we need to discuss some irregularities in your research protocols." The next hour passed in a blur of accusations and legal terminology that made Joseph's head spin. He was accused of research misconduct, of falsifying data, of violating university policies he'd never even heard of. Worse, he learned that his revolutionary techniques had been patented by the consortium he'd trusted, with Dr. Thompson listed as the primary researcher. "This is impossible," Joseph said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Amanda, you know this work was mine. You guided me through every step." Dr. Thompson's face was stone. "I'm sorry, Joseph, but the evidence clearly shows that your research was derivative of work already in progress. The university has no choice but to terminate your position and revoke your degree candidacy." Joseph felt as though the ground beneath him was crumbling away like soil in a drought. Everything he had worked for, everything he had believed about his calling and his future seemed to dissolve before his eyes. The laboratory that had been his sanctuary, the research that had been his prayer, the mentor who had been his guide, all of it was being stripped away. That night, Joseph sat in his small apartment staring at the boxes of personal items he'd been allowed to remove from his office. Among them was a small potted corn plant he'd been growing as part of an experiment, a tiny miracle of green life that seemed to mock him with its persistence. He opened his Bible to the story of Joseph in Egypt, seeking comfort in the familiar narrative of dreams betrayed and trust broken. But the words seemed to blur on the page, and his heart felt as dry as dust. "Why, Lord?" he whispered into the darkness. "I thought this was your plan. I thought you had called me to this work." The only answer was silence, deep and vast as the Texas sky. The legal battles that followed were exhausting and expensive. Joseph's family rallied around him, offering what support they could, but the strain began to show. His brothers, who had never fully understood his academic pursuits, began to voice opinions that cut deep. "Maybe it's time to come home and be practical," his oldest brother David suggested during a tense family dinner. "All this education, and for what? You should have stayed on the farm where you belong." "These university people," added his brother Michael, "they were never going to accept someone like us anyway. You were naive to trust them." Joseph felt the weight of their disappointment and his own failure pressing down on him like a heavy yoke. The dreams he'd carried since childhood, dreams of revolutionary agriculture that could feed the hungry and heal the earth, seemed as distant as stars. Grandfather Miguel, now in his 80s, was the only one who continued to offer unwavering support. "Mijo," he said one evening as they sat together on the porch, "remember what I taught you about planting seeds? That we plant in faith, trusting God to provide," Joseph replied automatically, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "See, but also remember, sometimes the seed must die before it can bring forth new life. Sometimes God allows our plans to be buried so that something even greater can grow." Joseph wanted to believe his grandfather's words, but the pain was too fresh, the betrayal too complete. He felt like a seed buried so deep in darkness that no light could ever reach it. After months of legal proceedings that drained his savings and his spirit, Joseph was forced to accept a settlement that acknowledged no wrongdoing on his part, but also prevented him from pursuing his research in the academic world. The consortium moved forward with their techniques, marketed as revolutionary breakthroughs in sustainable agriculture, while Joseph watched from the sidelines, powerless to claim his stolen dreams. The job offer came from an unexpected source, a small agricultural cooperative in rural Kansas that had heard about his situation through the academic grapevine. They offered him a position as an agricultural consultant, helping struggling family farms implement sustainable practices. The salary was a fraction of what he would have earned in academia, and the work was far from the cutting-edge research he'd envisioned. "It's honest work," his father said, trying to encourage him, "and maybe it's time for a fresh start." Joseph accepted the position with little enthusiasm, seeing it as exile rather than opportunity. The drive from Texas to Kansas felt like a journey into wilderness, each mile taking him further from the life he'd planned and the dreams he'd cherished. The flat plains of Kansas stretched endlessly in all directions, covered in seas of wheat and corn that rippled like golden water in the constant wind. The sky seemed impossibly vast, unmarked by mountains or trees, offering no place to hide from its immensity. The town of Harmony Springs, Kansas, population 847, was not the vibrant agricultural center Joseph had imagined. Main Street consisted of a grain elevator, a small grocery store, a diner called Martha's Kitchen, and a handful of other businesses that had seen better days. The cooperative's office occupied a converted farmhouse on the edge of town, its white paint peeling and its front porch sagging with the weight of too many harsh winters. Joseph's supervisor, a weathered man named Tom Garrison, greeted him with a firm handshake and eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and caution. "Welcome to Kansas, son," Tom said. "I'll be honest with you. Things have been tough around here. Drought, falling crop prices, big agribusiness squeezing out the family farms. Folks are hurting, and they're not sure about trusting an outsider with fancy degrees." The initial months were difficult. Joseph found himself working with farmers who viewed him with suspicion, visiting homesteads where hope had been worn thin by years of struggle. The techniques he suggested, cover cropping, careful water management, soil restoration, required faith in long-term benefits when most families were struggling to make it through the next season. "I don't have money for experiments," said Bill Patterson, a third-generation wheat farmer whose land was showing signs of severe erosion. "My grandfather farmed this land for 60 years without all these complications. If it was good enough for him, it's good enough for me." Joseph found himself sleeping in a small apartment above the cooperative office. The silence of the Kansas night, broken only by the whisper of wind through wheat fields. The loneliness was profound, and during those first weeks, he often questioned whether God had forgotten him entirely. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift in Joseph's heart. It started with the sunrise prayers that became his daily ritual. Unable to sleep past dawn, Joseph would walk out into the fields that surrounded the town, letting the vast sky and endless horizon draw his spirit toward heaven. The early morning light transformed the landscape into something sacred, painting the wheat in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of his grandfather's descriptions of God's glory. "Lord," he would pray as he walked among the grain, "I don't understand why I'm here. This isn't the life I planned, the work I dreamed of doing, but you see something I don't. Help me to trust you, even when I can't see the way forward." Gradually, Joseph began to notice things that his academic training had taught him to overlook. He saw how the older farmers, the ones who had worked the land for decades, possessed an intuitive understanding of the soil that couldn't be found in textbooks. He observed how certain fields that had been managed with careful attention to natural cycles were healthier than others that had been pushed to maximum production. Most importantly, he began to build relationships with the people he served. The breakthrough came during his third month in Kansas, when a severe storm threatened the wheat harvest across the region. Joseph found himself working alongside farmers to protect their crops, no longer the outside consultant with advanced degrees, but simply another set of hands willing to labor for the common good. As they worked through the night, securing equipment and covering vulnerable plants, Bill Patterson turned to Joseph and said, "You know, son, I misjudged you. You're not just here to tell us what we're doing wrong. You're here to work alongside us." The storm passed and most of the harvest was saved, but more than wheat was preserved that night. Joseph found himself welcomed into a community that valued character over credentials, relationship over research. The real transformation began when Joseph started listening as much as he spoke. Instead of arriving at farms with pre-planned solutions, He would spend time learning about each family's unique challenges, their history with the land, their hopes and fears for the future. At the Henderson family farm, he learned about multi-generational stewardship, how decisions made today would affect children and grandchildren. Sarah Henderson, a young mother of 3, showed him how she maintained a vegetable garden using techniques passed down from her great-grandmother. "We've always believed that the land doesn't belong to us," Sarah explained as they walked through her flourishing garden. "We're just caretakers for the next generation. Everything we do has to take that into account." Joseph felt his grandfather's wisdom echoing in her words, the same understanding of stewardship and responsibility that had shaped his childhood faith. But here in Kansas, that wisdom was being tested by harsh economic realities and challenging growing conditions. At the Morrison Ranch, Joseph met Jack Morrison, a cattle rancher who was struggling with overgrazing and soil degradation. Jack was a man of few words, skeptical of outsiders and resistant to change. But when Joseph spent a week working with him to implement rotational grazing practices, something shifted between them. "My father always said that the land will tell you what it needs if you know how to listen," Jack said one evening as they watched cattle move to a fresh pasture. "I think I forgot how to listen somewhere along the way." Joseph began to see his role not as an expert bringing knowledge to ignorant farmers, but as a facilitator helping people rediscover wisdom they already possessed. His scientific training became a tool for understanding and explaining natural processes that observant farmers had recognized intuitively for generations. Winter in Kansas was a season of reflection and planning. The fields lay dormant under blankets of snow, and the pace of work slowed to allow for deeper conversations and relationship building. Joseph found himself invited to community gatherings, church potlucks, and family dinners, where the talk flowed easily between practical concerns and matters of faith. At Harmony Springs Community Church, a small white building with a tall steeple that could be seen from miles away across the flat plains, Joseph encountered Pastor James Mitchell, a man whose understanding of Scripture was deeply rooted in agricultural metaphors. Jesus spoke in parables about seeds and soil, harvests and vineyards, because he knew that farming is the closest thing we have to understanding God's work in our lives, Pastor Mitchell explained during one of their conversations. The farmer plants in faith, tends with patience, and trusts God for the harvest. That's the spiritual life in a nutshell. Joseph began attending the small church regularly, finding comfort in worship that felt authentic and unadorned. The congregation of about 60 people included many of the farmers he worked with, and he was moved by their prayers for rain, for good harvests, for strength to persevere through difficult seasons. During the Christmas season, Joseph received a package from his grandfather, a small wooden box containing soil from their family farm in Texas. Tucked inside was a note written in Miguel's careful handwriting. "Mijo, this is the soil where your faith was planted. Remember that no matter where God takes you, those roots go deep." Joseph held the dark, rich earth in his hands and felt tears he hadn't expected. For the first time since his exile from academia, he sensed that perhaps this path, difficult as it was, might have purpose he couldn't yet see. Spring arrived in Kansas with a gentle insistence that spoke of resurrection and new beginnings. As Joseph walked among the emerging wheat shoots, he felt something stirring in his own spirit, not the ambitious dreams of his youth, but something deeper and more sustainable. The real test of his growing faith came during the spring planting season, when several families approached him with a proposal that would require him to risk his professional reputation and personal resources. "We've been talking," said Tom Garrison, "and we want to try something different this year. Some of the techniques you've been suggesting, the cover cropping, the natural soil enhancement, we're ready to commit to them on a larger scale." Joseph felt both excitement and terror. "That's wonderful, but you need to understand the risks. These methods take time to show results, and if they don't work, we're probably going to lose our farms anyway." Sarah Henderson interrupted. "We're already barely hanging on. At least this way, we're trying something that might make a real difference." A consortium of 5 families decided to pool their resources and implement Joseph's sustainable practices across 2,000 acres of farmland. It was a massive undertaking that would require careful coordination, significant investment in new equipment and seeds, and faith that methods proven in research settings would work in the challenging conditions of rural Kansas. Joseph threw himself into the project with an intensity that reminded him of his graduate school days, but with a crucial difference. This time, his work was grounded in relationship and community rather than individual ambition. Every decision was made in consultation with the farmers, every plan developed with their input and agreement. The planting season became a time of extraordinary collaboration. Joseph found himself working 16-hour days, moving from farm to farm, troubleshooting problems and encouraging farmers when doubts crept in. But instead of the isolation he'd experienced in academia, he was surrounded by people who shared both the work and the risk. "It's like we're all in this together," Bill Patterson observed one evening as they finished planting the last field. "Win or lose, we're doing it as a community." Joseph realized that somewhere along the way, his understanding of success had fundamentally changed. The individual achievement he'd once pursued had been replaced by something more meaningful, the opportunity to serve others and to be part of something larger than himself. As the newly planted fields began to show their first green shoots, Joseph established a routine of morning prayers that took him through all 5 participating farms. Walking among the emerging plants, he would pray for rain when it was needed, for protection from pests and diseases, for wisdom in managing the crops, and for the financial well-being of the families who had trusted him with their livelihoods. "Lord," he would pray as the sun rose over the endless Kansas horizon, "this is your creation, and these are your people. I'm just trying to be faithful with what you've given me. Help us to be good stewards of the gifts you've provided." The summer growing season brought both challenges and unexpected blessings. A late-season drought threatened to devastate conventional crops throughout the region, but the sustainable practices implemented on Joseph's project farms showed remarkable resilience. The improved soil retention and cover cropping techniques preserved moisture and protected the young plants during the driest weeks. News of the project's success began to spread beyond Harmony Springs. Agricultural extension agents from the state university came to observe the fields, and Joseph found himself once again presenting his methods to interested audiences. But this time, the farmers were his partners in the presentations, sharing their own insights and experiences. "The difference isn't just in the techniques," Sarah Henderson told a group of visiting farmers. "It's in the attitude. When you work with the land instead of against it, when you see farming as partnership with God's creation rather than domination over it, everything changes." Joseph listened to her words with amazement, recognizing his grandfather's wisdom spoken with a Kansas accent. The circle was beginning to close. The faith planted in Texas soil was bearing fruit in Kansas fields. But the real transformation in Joseph's understanding came through an unexpected encounter that would redirect his life once again. Grace Kimani arrived in Harmony Springs on a sweltering July afternoon, driving a dusty pickup truck loaded with supplies for the local food bank. She was a woman in her 30s, with dark skin that glowed with health and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. Her introduction to Joseph was characteristically direct. "You're the agricultural consultant everyone's talking about," she said, extending a strong hand for a firm handshake. "I'm Grace. I run a non-profit that works with farming communities in East Africa. I've been hearing interesting things about what you're doing here." Over coffee at Martha's kitchen, Grace shared her story. Born in Kenya, educated in agricultural development at Iowa State, she had returned to Africa to work with subsistence farmers struggling with drought, soil depletion, and food insecurity. Her organization, Seeds of Hope International, focused on implementing sustainable farming practices that could increase yields while preserving the environment. "The techniques you're developing here," Grace explained, "they could make a profound difference in communities where families are living on the edge of survival. But the real key is the approach you're taking, working with farmers as partners, building on local knowledge, creating community-based solutions." Joseph felt his heart stirring with familiar excitement, but tempered now by experience and wisdom. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that you come to Kenya for 6 months to help train farmers and local agricultural agents in these methods. It would be challenging work. Remote villages, basic accommodations, language barriers, but the potential impact." Grace paused, and Joseph could see the passion burning in her eyes, the same fire that had once driven his own research. "There's a region called Nyanza Province where drought has devastated traditional farming. Families are going hungry, young people are leaving for the cities, communities are breaking apart. But the soil is good, and the people are resilient. They just need hope and practical tools to rebuild." That night, Joseph walked out into the wheat fields that had become his sanctuary, looking up at stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear Kansas sky. The wheat rustled around him in the gentle night breeze, and he felt the presence of God as clearly as he felt the soft earth beneath his feet. "Is this your plan, Lord?" he prayed. "Are you calling me to leave this place just as I'm beginning to find my purpose here?" The answer didn't come in words, but in a deep peace that settled over his spirit like a gentle benediction. Joseph realized that his time in Kansas had not been exile. It had been preparation. The humility he'd learned, the partnership skills he'd developed, the faith he'd rebuilt, all of it had been shaping him for something larger. The decision to accept Grace's invitation was not easy. The farmers who had become his partners and friends were initially resistant to the idea of his leaving, even temporarily. "You're finally starting to understand how we do things here," Tom Garrison protested. "Why would you want to go halfway around the world to start over again?" But as Joseph explained his sense of calling, the same community that had embraced him began to support his new direction. The farmers organized fundraisers to help support his work in Africa, and several of them committed to traveling to Kenya themselves to see the project firsthand. "If God is calling you to this work," Pastor Mitchell said during a special commissioning service at the community church, "then we're called to support you. You're not leaving us. You're extending our ministry to places we could never reach on our own." The 6 months Joseph spent in Kenya transformed not only the farming communities he served, but his own understanding of his calling and purpose. Working in villages where families survived on less than $1 a day, where drought could mean the difference between life and death, he discovered that agriculture was about much more than crop yields and soil science. In the village of Kogolome, Joseph worked with a group of women farmers who had been struggling to feed their families after several seasons of failed rains. Using simplified versions of the techniques he'd developed in Kansas, adapted to local conditions and traditional practices, they were able to increase their harvest by 60%. "Asante sana," said Mama Akinyi, an elderly woman whose weathered hands held the same wisdom Joseph had seen in his grandfather's touch. "Thank you for showing us that there is still hope in the soil." Joseph felt tears sting his eyes as he realized that this was what his grandfather had been preparing him for all those years ago. Not just to understand agriculture, but to understand how farming could be a ministry of hope to those who had almost lost faith in tomorrow. The work was challenging in ways Joseph had never imagined. Language barriers, cultural differences, equipment failures, and bureaucratic obstacles tested his patience and resolve daily. But working alongside Grace, whose combination of practical expertise and spiritual wisdom inspired everyone around her, Joseph found himself growing in ways he hadn't experienced since his early days with his grandfather. "Faith without works is dead," Grace reminded him one evening as they sat by a cooking fire in a remote village, planning the next day's training session. But works without faith are just empty activity. When we combine practical skills with trust in God's provision, that's when miracles happen. The miracles began small. A widow's maize crop that survived the dry season, a young father who was able to send his children to school with the proceeds from his improved harvest, a community that came together to build a water conservation system that benefited everyone. But the larger miracle was the restoration of hope. Joseph watched communities that had been trapped in cycles of poverty and despair begin to believe again in the possibility of a better future. Children who had been malnourished began to thrive. Young people who had been planning to leave for the cities began to see opportunities in agriculture. During his final week in Kenya, Joseph received news that would test his newfound peace and purpose once more. Dr. Amanda Thompson had contacted him through the Agricultural Cooperative in Kansas, requesting a meeting to discuss his work in Africa. "She says there's been some developments regarding your original research," Tom Garrison explained during a crackling phone call. "She wants to discuss some kind of partnership opportunity." Joseph felt the old wounds stirring, the pain of betrayal and broken trust threatening to disturb the peace he'd found. But as he prayed about the situation, he realized that the time had come for a different kind of harvest, a harvest of forgiveness and reconciliation. When Joseph returned to Kansas, he found his work had continued to flourish in his absence. The farmers he'd partnered with had not only maintained the sustainable practices he'd introduced, but had begun training other farmers throughout the region. What had started as a small experiment had become a movement. The meeting with Dr. Thompson took place at the University of Kansas in a conference room that reminded Joseph painfully of the academic world he'd been forced to leave. But when Amanda walked into the room, Joseph was shocked by her appearance. The confident, commanding presence he remembered had been replaced by someone who looked tired and troubled. "Joseph," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology that's long overdue." Over the next 2 hours, Amanda told a story that Joseph had never suspected. She had been under enormous pressure from the university to produce commercially viable research, with threats to her tenure and funding if she didn't deliver results. When the consortium had approached her about Joseph's work, she had initially resisted. But they made it clear that they were going to take your research one way or another, she explained, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. They said I could either be part of the process and maintain some control, or I could be destroyed along with you. Joseph listened with a mixture of anger and compassion as Amanda described how the consortium had systematically stolen his work, using legal technicalities and academic politics to cover their tracks. She had convinced herself that she was protecting him by taking credit for the research, keeping it from being completely corrupted by commercial interests. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, Amanda said. I know I could have found another way, should have fought harder. But I was afraid, and I chose my own security over doing what was right. Joseph felt the weight of years of anger and resentment pressing against his heart. Every instinct told him to reject her apology, to remind her of the pain she had caused, the dreams she had helped destroy. But as he looked at this broken woman who had once been his mentor, he heard his grandfather's voice whispering in his memory, "Forgiveness is not about them deserving it, mijo. It's about freeing your own heart to love again." "Amanda," Joseph said quietly, "I forgive you." The words seemed to surprise them both. Amanda looked up at him with amazement, as if she couldn't believe what she had heard. "The consortium is falling apart," she continued after a moment. "Their implementation of your techniques has failed because they tried to commercialize them without understanding the relationship and community components that make them work. There are lawsuits, investigations. The truth is finally coming out." She slid a folder across the table to Joseph. "My lawyers say that with the new evidence that's emerged, you could reclaim credit for your research. You could probably sue for millions in damages." Joseph opened the folder and saw documents that could restore his academic reputation, financial statements that showed the profits made from his stolen work, legal opinions that outlined his options for recourse. But as he read, he felt a strange detachment from the whole situation. "What is it you want from me, Amanda?" he asked. "I want you to come back to the university," she said. "Take my position as department head. Let me help you rebuild your career and get the recognition you deserve." Joseph closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "I appreciate the offer, Amanda, and I appreciate your apology. But I'm not the same person who left here 5 years ago. I've found my calling, and it's not in academia." Amanda stared at him in disbelief. "But this is your chance to get everything back. Your reputation, your research, your future." Joseph smiled, thinking of Mama Akini's weathered hands, planting seeds with unshakable faith, of Sarah Henderson's garden that fed her family and neighbors, of Grace Kimani's tireless work to bring hope to forgotten communities. "I don't want it back," he said simply. "God has given me something better." The conversation continued for another hour, with Amanda struggling to understand how Joseph could walk away from vindication and return to what she saw as obscurity. But Joseph found himself filled with a peace that surpassed understanding, knowing that his path forward was clear. When Joseph returned to Harmony Springs, he was welcomed as a hero by the farming community. News of his work in Kenya had spread, and he found himself flooded with invitations to speak at conferences, consult with agricultural organizations, and lead international development projects. But the most meaningful welcome came from his family in Texas, who had followed his journey with growing pride and understanding. His brothers, who had once criticized his academic pursuits, now spoke with admiration of his work, helping struggling farmers and communities. "I never understood what you were trying to do before," his brother David admitted during a family gathering. "But I see it now. You're using your gifts to serve others, just like Abuelo always taught us." Grandfather Miguel, now in his late 80s but still sharp and wise, embraced Joseph with tears in his eyes. "Mijo," he whispered, "you have become the man God always intended you to be." The reunion with his family was healing in ways Joseph hadn't expected. Years of separation and misunderstanding melted away as they worked together in the family fields, as they shared meals and stories, as they prayed together in the evening stillness. But Joseph knew that his calling was taking him in a new direction. With Grace's encouragement and the support of Seeds of Hope International, he began developing a new organization that would train agricultural consultants to work with subsistence farming communities around the world. The Global Agricultural Ministry, as it came to be known, would combine the latest sustainable farming techniques with community development principles and spiritual care. The vision was ambitious: to create a network of agricultural missionaries who could bring both practical hope and spiritual transformation to the world's most challenging farming regions. The first training center was established on 500 acres of farmland outside of Harmony Springs, Kansas, purchased with donations from the farming community and churches that had witnessed Joseph's transformation. The land itself became a laboratory where trainees could practice sustainable farming techniques while living in community and growing in faith. Grace became Joseph's partner in leading the organization, bringing her deep experience in international development and her gift for building relationships across cultural boundaries. Together, they developed a training program that was as much about spiritual formation as agricultural education. "We're not just teaching farming techniques," Grace explained to the first group of trainees, a diverse collection of missionaries, agricultural graduates, and experienced farmers from around the world. "We're learning how to see agriculture as ministry, how to approach struggling communities with humility and respect, how to plant seeds of hope in the hardest soil." The trainees lived simply, sharing meals and prayers, working in the fields from dawn to dusk, studying both agricultural science and biblical principles of stewardship. Joseph found himself drawing constantly on his grandfather's wisdom, sharing stories of faith and farming that bridged cultures and languages. "When we plant a seed," Joseph told one group as they worked together in the experimental plots, "we're participating in God's creative power. We prepare the soil, plant the seed, tend the crop, but the miracle of growth comes from God alone. Our job is to be faithful stewards of the process." The first class of agricultural missionaries graduated after 6 months of intensive training, then scattered to projects in Central America, Africa, Asia, and even disadvantaged rural communities in the United States. Their reports back to the center told stories of transformation that reminded Joseph why he had been called to this work. In Guatemala, Maria Santos used cover cropping and natural soil enhancement to help indigenous farmers double their maize yields while preserving traditional farming practices. In Bangladesh, David Kim worked with rice farmers to develop flood-resistant growing techniques that protected both crops and communities during monsoon seasons. But the reports that moved Joseph most deeply were those that described spiritual transformation alongside agricultural improvement. Communities that had lost hope were rediscovering faith. Families that had been fragmenting were coming together around shared work and purpose. Churches were being planted in villages where the gospel had never taken root. The gospel of the kingdom isn't just about personal salvation, Joseph reflected during one of his evening devotions. It's about God's transformation of all creation, including the soil beneath our feet and the communities that depend on it. As the global agricultural ministry grew and expanded, Joseph found himself traveling constantly, training new missionaries, consulting with existing projects, speaking at conferences and churches about the intersection of faith and agriculture. But no matter how far his work took him, he always returned to the fields of Kansas, to the community that had first taught him the meaning of faithful service. One autumn evening, as Joseph walked through the original experimental plots that had started his journey in Kansas, he encountered a familiar figure among the corn stalks. Grandfather Miguel, now 91 and moving slowly but still insisting on working in the soil, was examining the plants with the same careful attention Joseph remembered from his childhood. "Abuelo," Joseph said, surprised to find him there. "What are you doing here?" Miguel smiled, his weathered face creased with joy. "I wanted to see where my little seed had finally taken root," he said. "I wanted to see what God grew from all those mornings we spent together in the soil." They walked together through the fields as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The corn rustled around them in the evening breeze, whispering songs of praise for the harvest to come. "You know, mijo," Miguel said as they reached the edge of the field, "when you were a little boy, I used to pray that God would use you to feed his people. I never imagined how big his answer would be." Joseph felt tears of gratitude flowing down his cheeks as he looked out over the training center that had become a launching pad for agricultural ministry around the world. Students from 20 different countries were currently in residence, learning not just farming techniques, but how to carry hope to the world's forgotten places. "It wasn't my plan, Abuelo," Joseph said softly. "I thought I knew what success looked like, but God had a different harvest in mind." Miguel nodded slowly, his eyes bright with wisdom and love. "That's the thing about faith, mijo. We plant the seeds we can see, but God grows the harvest we can't imagine." As winter settled over the Kansas plains, Joseph found himself entering a season of reflection and planning. The global agricultural ministry was thriving, with training centers opening on 3 continents and agricultural missionaries serving in over 40 countries. The techniques he had originally developed in his graduate research had been adapted and implemented in countless communities, bringing hope and abundance to places that had known only scarcity. But Joseph's vision was expanding beyond agricultural training to encompass something even more transformative: the development of sustainable Christian communities that could model God's intended relationship between humanity and creation. Working with Grace and a team of theologians, community development specialists, and agricultural scientists, Joseph began developing plans for creation care communities, intentional Christian communities built around sustainable agriculture, environmental stewardship, and service to the surrounding region. The first pilot community was planned for a 2,000-acre site in northern Kenya, where drought and climate change had devastated traditional farming. The vision was ambitious: a community of 100 families who would demonstrate sustainable farming practices while running schools, medical clinics and agricultural training centers for the surrounding region. It's like the Benedictine monasteries of the medieval period, Grace explained to potential supporters. Communities of faith that preserved knowledge, served their neighbors, and demonstrated a different way of living in relationship with God and creation. The fundraising and planning for the Kenya project took 2 years, but Joseph found the process deeply meaningful. Churches and individuals from around the world contributed not just money, but prayers, volunteer labor, and ongoing commitment to support the community once it was established. When the first families arrived in Kenya to begin construction of the Creation Care community, Joseph was there to help break ground for the first buildings. As he pressed a shovel into the red African soil, he felt the presence of his grandfather's spirit and the blessing of countless generations of faithful farmers who had seen their work as worship. The community grew slowly but steadily, adding families and facilities as resources became available. Within 5 years, the Kenya Creation Care community was home to 300 people from 12 different countries, united by their commitment to sustainable agriculture and service to their neighbors. The agricultural innovations developed by the community, drought-resistant crop varieties, water conservation systems, integrated pest management techniques, were freely shared with farmers throughout East Africa. The schools operated by the community served over 1,000 children from the surrounding region, many of whom had never had access to education before. But perhaps most importantly, the community served as a beacon of hope in a region that had experienced decades of conflict and hardship. The sight of green fields flourishing in an area that had been devastated by drought, the sound of children's laughter echoing across the landscape, the witness of people from different backgrounds working together in love, all of it spoke of God's power to bring life from death, hope from despair. Joseph divided his time between the Kansas Training Center and the Kenya community, but his heart was increasingly drawn to the work of community development. He began to see that his calling was not just to improve agricultural practices, but to help demonstrate what the kingdom of God could look like when lived out in relationship with creation. The theological implications of this work deepened Joseph's understanding of the gospel in ways he had never expected. Working with Bible scholars and creation care theologians, he began to see that the message of redemption included not just human salvation, but the restoration of all creation. When Jesus taught us to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," Joseph explained during a conference on faith and agriculture, he was calling us to work for the transformation of everything, including the soil beneath our feet and the communities that depend on it. This expanded understanding of the gospel began to attract attention from mainstream churches and denominations that had traditionally focused primarily on individual salvation. Joseph found himself invited to speak at seminaries, denominational headquarters, and major Christian conferences about the relationship between environmental stewardship and faithful discipleship. The response was not always positive. Some critics accused Joseph of replacing the gospel with environmental activism, of focusing on temporal concerns rather than eternal salvation. But Joseph responded to these critiques with grace and biblical clarity. "I'm not replacing the gospel," he would explain patiently. "I'm simply recognizing that God's plan of redemption is bigger than we sometimes imagine. When Paul wrote in Romans that all creation is groaning and waiting for the sons of God to be revealed, he was talking about environmental restoration as part of God's ultimate plan. As Joseph entered his 50s, his hair beginning to show silver and his face lined by years of work in the sun, he found himself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought him to this place. The betrayal and exile that had once seemed like the end of his dreams had become the doorway to a calling more meaningful than anything he could have imagined. The academic recognition he had once craved seemed irrelevant now, though honors and awards had come anyway. Recognition from the United Nations for sustainable development work, honorary doctorates from universities around the world, invitations to advise governments on agricultural policy. But these accolades felt like echoes of someone else's life. The real measure of success was found in the faces of farmers who had learned to hope again, in communities that had discovered new life in the midst of difficulty, in young people who were choosing to dedicate their lives to service rather than self-advancement. Grace had become more than a ministry partner. Their relationship had deepened into love and marriage, a union blessed by communities on 3 continents. Their wedding took place in the fields of the Kansas Training Center, with guests from around the world gathering to celebrate not just their personal commitment, but the global family they had helped create. God has given us a beautiful picture of His love, Pastor Mitchell said during the ceremony, in the way you have learned to work together to bring life from the soil and hope to the world. Joseph and Grace's 3 children, 2 biological and 1 adopted from the Kenya community, grew up bilingual and bicultural, as comfortable in African villages as on Kansas farms, learning from childhood that following Jesus meant caring for creation and serving those in need. As the global agricultural ministry entered its 2nd decade, Joseph began to focus more on training indigenous leaders to carry the work forward. The goal was never to create dependence on outside expertise, but to equip local communities to solve their own challenges and share their knowledge with their neighbors. The most satisfying part of this transition was seeing former trainees become trainers themselves, adapting the principles of sustainable agriculture and community development to their own cultural contexts and local conditions. The movement was becoming truly global and indigenous, rooted in local soil, but connected by shared values and mutual support. Joseph's role was increasingly that of elder and encourager rather than director and decision-maker. He spent more time listening than speaking, more time praying than planning. The ambitious young man who had once dreamed of revolutionizing agriculture had been transformed into a humble servant who understood that the real revolution was in the hearts of people who learned to trust God with their lives and their land. During one particularly meaningful visit to the Kenya community, Joseph found himself walking at dawn through fields that had once been barren and hopeless. The sound of morning prayers drifted across the landscape as families began their daily rhythm of work and worship. Children ran between the rows of flourishing crops, their laughter mixing with the songs of birds that had returned as the ecosystem was restored. "Lord," Joseph prayed as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors, "thank you for showing me that your plans are always better than mine. Thank you for using even betrayal and disappointment to shape me into the person you needed me to become." Standing there in the African dawn, surrounded by the evidence of God's faithfulness and the fruit of faithful human cooperation with divine purposes, Joseph felt a deep peace that he knew would sustain him through whatever seasons lay ahead. The call to return to Texas came when grandfather Miguel turned 96 and began to fail in health. Joseph left Grace to manage the international work while he returned to care for the man who had first planted seeds of faith in his young heart. Those final months with his grandfather were among the most precious of Joseph's life. Miguel's body was failing, but his spirit remained strong, his eyes still bright with love and wisdom. They spent long hours together in the family fields, Miguel sharing memories and insights that Joseph treasured like precious seeds. "I'm ready to go home, mijo," Miguel said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky. "I can see that the seeds we planted together have grown into something more beautiful than I ever dreamed." When Miguel passed peacefully in his sleep on a warm spring night, Joseph felt not just grief, but profound gratitude for a life that had demonstrated faithful stewardship from beginning to end. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Miguel's influence. Family members, former students, farmers from across Texas, and representatives from the global ministry that had grown from seeds planted in his modest fields. During the graveside service, Joseph spoke words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his own understanding. "Grandfather Miguel used to tell me that when we plant seeds, we participate in God's creative power. We plant in faith, not knowing exactly what will grow, but trusting that God will bring the harvest in His perfect timing. Today, we're planting Abuelo's body in the soil he loved, trusting that God will raise up a harvest of eternal life that we can't yet imagine." After the funeral, Joseph made a decision that surprised even himself. He resigned from the day-to-day leadership of the global agricultural ministry, turning that responsibility over to Grace and the international board they had developed. He would remain available for consultation and special projects, but his primary calling was now to return to the soil where his faith had been planted. Joseph took over management of the family farm in Texas, implementing the sustainable practices he had spent decades developing and teaching. But this wasn't a retreat from ministry. It was a return to the source. The farm became a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture, a retreat center for agricultural missionaries, and a place of pilgrimage for people who wanted to understand the relationship between faith and farming. Young people from around the world came to spend time on the farm, learning not just agricultural techniques, but the deeper principles of faithful stewardship that Miguel had taught and Joseph had carried to the ends of the earth. Many of these visitors went on to establish similar farms and communities in their own countries, creating a quiet revolution of faith-based, sustainable agriculture. As Joseph entered his 60s, his life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. He rose each morning before dawn to walk in the fields, praying for the day ahead and for the global network of communities and ministries that had grown from those early experiments in Kansas. He worked with his hands in the soil, tending crops and teaching visitors, finding in the simple rhythm of planting and harvesting a form of worship that connected him to generations of faithful farmers. Evenings were spent writing memoirs, theological reflections on creation care, practical guides for sustainable agriculture. But his most treasured times were spent with Grace and their children when they visited, and with the steady stream of former students and ministry partners who came to the farm seeking wisdom and encouragement. "This is what I was always meant to do," Joseph reflected one evening as he sat on the same porch where he had learned to pray as a child. "Not to conquer the world with my ideas, but to be faithful in this small place, trusting God to multiply the impact." The multiplication continued in ways that amazed him. The global agricultural ministry now operated in over 80 countries. The creation care communities had been replicated on every continent, and thousands of agricultural missionaries carried the principles of sustainable farming and community development to the world's most challenging places. But perhaps more importantly, the vision of agriculture as ministry, of farming as a form of worship, had taken root in countless individual hearts. Joseph regularly received letters from farmers who had never heard of his formal ministry, but who had embraced the understanding that caring for creation was a form of faithful discipleship. One particularly meaningful letter came from a young farmer in Iowa who had grown up in urban poverty but felt called to agriculture after hearing Joseph speak at a conference. "You helped me understand that farming isn't just about producing food," the young man wrote. "It's about participating in God's ongoing creation, about caring for the gifts He's given us, about serving others through the work of our hands. My small farm will never change the world, but it's changing me, and that seems to be enough." Joseph kept that letter in his Bible, a reminder that the real harvest of his life's work was not measured in acres farmed or organizations founded, but in hearts transformed and lives redirected toward faithful service. As he approached his 70th birthday, Joseph began to experience health challenges that reminded him of his own mortality. A heart attack during harvest season forced him to slow down and delegate more responsibility to younger hands. But rather than feeling frustrated by these limitations, Joseph found himself entering a new season of spiritual depth and reflection. Spending more time in prayer and meditation, Joseph began to see his entire life journey with new clarity. The betrayal that had seemed so devastating decades ago was revealed as God's way of redirecting him from selfish ambition to selfless service. The years of struggle and uncertainty in Kansas had been necessary preparation for the international ministry that followed. Even the current season of physical limitation was serving a purpose, teaching him to trust others and to find meaning in being rather than doing. "I used to think that my value came from what I could accomplish," Joseph shared during a videotaped interview that would become part of the agricultural ministry's training materials. "But I've learned that God values us not for what we do, but for who we become in relationship with Him. All the work, all the ministry, all the success, it's just the fruit of that relationship." The interview became one of the most watched resources in the ministry's library, touching hearts around the world with its simple message of faith, perseverance, and trust in God's perfect timing. As Joseph entered his final years, his farm became a pilgrimage destination for people seeking to understand the integration of faith and environmental stewardship. Visitors came from every continent, representing every denomination and tradition within Christianity, united by their desire to learn how farming could become a form of spiritual practice. Joseph welcomed them all with the same gracious hospitality his grandfather had shown to him as a child. He would walk with them through the fields, sharing stories and insights, but mostly listening to their own journeys and dreams. Many visitors commented that they learned as much from Joseph's presence as from his words. The deep peace that surrounded him, the obvious joy he found in simple tasks, the way he seemed to see God's hand in every aspect of creation. "He's become what Grandfather Miguel was for me," Joseph realized one day, as he watched a group of young agricultural missionaries hanging on his every word. A bridge between generations, a living example of what it means to serve God through caring for creation. The responsibility of being that bridge humbled and inspired Joseph in equal measure. He spent increasing time in prayer, asking God to use his remaining years wisely, to speak through him the words that needed to be heard, to demonstrate through his life the peace that comes from complete surrender to divine will. One spring morning, as Joseph walked through fields green with young corn that reached toward heaven in silent praise, he felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of death, but the completion of purpose fulfilled. He had become the man God had always intended him to be, had discovered the calling that had been planted in his heart as a child, had learned to trust in the goodness of God's plan, even when that plan was mysterious and difficult. "Thank you, Lord," he prayed as the morning sun painted the world in gold and green, "for taking a broken seed and growing something beautiful. Thank you for showing me that your way is always better than mine, even when I can't see where you're leading." The wind rustled through the corn stalks around him, and Joseph heard in that sound the same whisper he had heard as a child in his grandfather's fields. The voice of a God who created with love, who redeemed with grace, and who called his children to participate in the ongoing work of making all things new. As the years passed, Joseph's direct involvement in farming gradually decreased, but his influence on the global movement he had helped create continued to grow. The agricultural ministry he and Grace had founded now trained over 1,000 missionaries each year, operated permanent communities on 4 continents, and had documented success in improving agricultural yields and community health in some of the world's most challenging environments. More importantly, the vision of agriculture as ministry had taken root in mainstream Christianity. Seminaries offered courses in creation care theology. Denominations included environmental stewardship in their mission statements, and churches around the world established community gardens and sustainable agriculture programs as expressions of their faith. Joseph's final public appearance came at his 75th birthday celebration, a gathering held at the original training center in Kansas that drew over 2,000 participants from around the world. Former students, ministry partners, family members, and supporters filled the auditorium and spilled out into the surrounding fields. Grace, now in her 60s but still vibrant and actively leading the international ministry, introduced her husband with words that captured the essence of his life and calling. 75 years ago, God planted a seed in the heart of a little boy who loved to dig in the dirt with his grandfather. None of us could have imagined what would grow from that simple beginning. But God knew. God always knows what he's growing, even when we can't see the harvest. Joseph rose slowly to the podium, his body showing the effects of decades of physical labor and his recent heart problems, but his eyes still bright with the joy and peace that had sustained him through every season of his journey. "When I was young," he began, his voice still strong, despite his physical frailty, "I thought I knew what success looked like. I thought my value would come from what I could accomplish, from the recognition I could earn, from the difference I could make through my own efforts." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces that represented a global family united by shared commitment to faithful stewardship. But God had a different plan. He allowed my dreams to be broken so that he could give me his dream. He allowed my strength to fail so that I could learn to depend on his strength. He allowed my path to wind through valleys of difficulty and seasons of uncertainty because that's where he wanted to teach me to trust him completely. Joseph's voice grew stronger as he continued, the passion of his calling still burning bright despite the years. The work we do in the soil is a metaphor for the work God does in our hearts. He plants seeds of calling and purpose, but first, He has to break up the hard ground of our self-reliance. He waters those seeds with trials and challenges that teach us to depend on Him. He sends seasons of waiting that teach us patience and seasons of growth that build our faith. The audience listened in reverent silence as Joseph shared the theological insights that had shaped his understanding of agriculture as ministry. And then comes the harvest, not just crops from the ground, but transformation in hearts and communities and lives. The harvest is never just about us. It's always about God using our faithfulness to bless others, to demonstrate His love, to show the world what life looks like when it's lived in harmony with His purposes. Joseph concluded his remarks with a prayer that would be remembered and repeated in agricultural ministry contexts around the world. Heavenly Father, thank You for the privilege of participating in Your creative work. Thank You for showing us that every seed planted in faith, every act of care for Your creation, every effort to serve others through the work of our hands is a form of worship that brings glory to Your name. Help us to remember that the harvest is always Yours. The timing is always Yours. The power to bring life from the soil is always Yours. We are just Your servants, privileged to watch You work miracles through ordinary seeds and faithful hands. Amen. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, but Joseph barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the crowd, and those who knew him best recognized the look of a man who was seeing into eternity, who was already beginning to glimpse the ultimate harvest that awaited all faithful servants. 3 months later, Joseph passed peacefully in his sleep at the family farm in Texas, his hand resting on a Bible open to Jesus' parable of the mustard seed. Grace found him early that morning, his face peaceful and serene, looking as though he had simply fallen asleep while communing with the God he had served so faithfully. The funeral was held outdoors in the fields where Joseph had first learned to pray as a child. Thousands gathered from around the world to pay their respects to a man who had shown them how to see the sacred in the ordinary, how to find God in the soil, how to trust in divine purposes even when the way forward was unclear. Pastor Mitchell, now in his 80s but still serving the community church in Harmony Springs, delivered the eulogy with words that captured the essence of Joseph's life and legacy. Joseph Martinez understood something that our modern world has largely forgotten, that there is no separation between the sacred and the secular, between worship and work, between faith and farming. He showed us that when we tend God's creation with love and reverence, when we serve others through the work of our hands, when we trust in divine timing rather than human ambition, we participate in the very heart of God. The burial was simple, in the same Texas soil where Joseph had first learned to plant seeds with his grandfather, but the legacy lived on in countless ways. In the farmers around the world who continued to practice sustainable agriculture as a form of spiritual discipline, in the communities that demonstrated God's love through caring for creation, in the young people who chose lives of service over lives of self-advancement. Grace continued to lead the global agricultural ministry for another decade before passing leadership to the next generation of agricultural missionaries. But the vision that had begun with a little boy and his grandfather in the Texas soil had taken on a life of its own, spreading like seeds on the wind to take root in hearts and communities around the world. And in the quiet moments before sleep, in that sacred space where earthly concerns give way to eternal truths, the story of Joseph Martinez continues to speak to hearts that long to find their purpose in God's perfect plan. His life reminds us that God's timing is always perfect, that His ways are always higher than our ways, that He can take even our greatest disappointments and weave them into His beautiful plan of redemption and restoration. Like the seeds that trust the darkness of soil to become the birthplace of new life, Joseph learned to trust the darkness of difficulty to become the birthplace of divine purpose. Like the farmer who plants in faith not knowing exactly what tomorrow will bring, he learned to plant his life in God's hands, trusting that the harvest would come in perfect timing. And so tonight, as we rest in the promise that God works all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose, we can close our eyes in peace, knowing that our own lives, with all their broken dreams and unexpected turns, with all their seasons of struggle and moments of grace, are being woven into a story more beautiful than we can imagine. For we serve the God of the harvest, the God who brings life from death, hope from despair, purpose from confusion, and in His perfect timing, in His infinite love, He will bring to completion the good work He has begun in each of us. Rest now in this promise. Rest in the knowledge that you are loved beyond measure, that your life has meaning and purpose, that God's plan for you is good and perfect and beautiful. Rest in the peace that comes from complete surrender to the one who holds tomorrow in His hands. And may your dreams be filled with golden fields reaching toward heaven, with the sound of gentle rain on thirsty soil, with the whisper of wind through grain that speaks of God's faithfulness from generation to generation. In the name of Jesus, who taught us to see God's kingdom in seeds and soil, in growth and harvest, in the patient rhythm of planting and waiting and trusting in divine provision. Amen.